would like to start with your experience in Kenya. And you're an outspoken critic about corruption in Kenya. And your outspoken role did not endear you to many of the political elite in Kenya. And in fact, there was even a motion to censure you in the Kenyan parliament at some point. Why did you decide the issue of corruption was important enough to highlight it?
Sure. Well, it's really the nexus between ethnic politics and corruption. And when you bring those two things together, it's a very volatile mix. And it's, as we saw in the post-election crisis, very destabilizing to the country. Because what you find is that the corrupt political class, if you will, and that's very broad-based, uses money to influence people. And that results in this, in exacerbating ethnic tensions. And results in the kind of terrible conflicts we saw in 2008. So it's clear that addressing the corruption issue, addressing the problem of ethnic politics, is crucial to the future stability of the country, and that's why I focused on it. And, you know, it's interesting, and it's probably an appropriate moment to recall that when then Senator Obama visited Kenya in 2006, he delivered a major speech at the University of Nairobi. I had just arrived, where he talked about that connection between ethnic politics and corruption, and said that it was the biggest problem facing the nation. Of course, he was very prescient because we saw what happened in 2008.
Interesting. So, do you ever, during your time when you're outspoken about corruption, do you ever have anyone or hear from anyone in the State Department or the White House telling you that you overstepped your bounds?
No, actually, they were very supportive. You know, it's interesting. I was appointed by President Bush. I continued under President Obama. And I must say both administrations were very supportive of what I did. And the reason is really pretty straightforward. I mean, it's important to advance U.S. policy. We want to see a stable, democratic Kenya. And in order to do that, you've got to deal with these issues of corruption and ethnic politics. So I actually had very, very strong support from Washington throughout my tenure.
So how do you see your role as an ambassador in a country like Kenya, or in general in Africa?
Yeah.
Are you there to make friends and be the face of the U.S. government, or are you there to speak out on policy, and can you do both?
Well, you're there to do both in a way. I mean, what you're there to do is to represent the government, to represent the United States. And to me, that means representing all aspects, representing the values, the interests of the United States. And in order to be an effective ambassador, you've got to get to know the people, not just the elites, but the ordinary people, literally the man in the street, the young people, women, farmers. I mean, so you have a sense of what's on their mind. And so you have a dialogue with people about what Americans believe, what do Kenyans believe, how can we help, how can we be a partner. It really is about partnership. I always stress that. And you know, I believe certainly serving in a country like Kenya was a privilege because so many the vast majority of Kenyans like Americans, and that was well before they'd ever heard about Barack Obama. That goes way, way back. So it's great to be in that kind of environment, and in that kind of environment, you have even more ability to reach out and talk to people. So it's really all of those things, and you know, you basically advance U.S. interest as you see them, and if that means tackling corruption and not being a friend of some of the political leaders, well, then so be it. I mean, let the chips fall where they may.
So in line with that, in the elections in 2008, there was a rash of post-election violence.
Yes.
That the world watched. And you have said in the past, you said an unholy triumvirate of causes, such as negative ethnicity, poverty, and a culture of impunity combined caused the violence. Can you explain what you meant by that?
Yeah. Well, again, if we go back, we look at the use of ethnicity in politics, so negative ethnicity, if you will. That's been a history in Kenya going back many, many years. You look at the culture of impunity, which means that people get away with corruption. As I've said, look at Kenya's history. There's never been a minister put in jail for corruption. And people said, well, when will we know we're making progress? And I said, you'll know when you're making progress when a minister is put in jail for corruption. So that culture of impunity, and frankly, it also goes beyond corruption. It goes to violence. I mean, look at the history of political assassinations in Kenya. No one ever held responsible. So the culture of impunity. And so when you add those things up, it is what leads to the kind of crisis that we saw in 2008. I mean, it was surprising in a way because Kenyans are basically decent people, nice people, peaceful people. So to see that level of violence was certainly it was unusual in Kenya's history. There's always been some violence connected with the political process, but nothing on that scale. So it took people aback. But what it shows is those kind of underlying causes create deep, deep tensions in the society, which burst forth in a crisis of that nature. Because when you have the culture of impunity, when you have negative ethnicity, that means that all of the political leaders and all of the ethnic groups are looking at politics as what we would call a zero-sum game, where whoever captures the presidency wins the whole thing, which means my group is going to benefit from that, and all the other groups won't benefit. If Moy wins, it's the Kalenjins. If so-and-so wins, it's the... So it really creates that kind of deep unhappiness, which again can lead to that kind of crisis.
Yeah, and during the same time, the U.S. worked with Kofi Annan and the African Union to mediation efforts between Odinga and Kibaki. How did that process work, and why was the U.S. uniquely positioned to play a role in that effort?
Yeah. Well, the United States is Kenya's largest partner, I mean, in every sense, in terms of the kind of assistance flowing to Kenya. It's vastly more than any other country provides. The people-to-people ties that go all the way back to the Kennedy airlift. Those ties have been there for a long time. So even more than the United Kingdom, the U.S. has always been perceived as Kenya's biggest partner. So when a crisis of that nature struck, people inevitably looked to the U.S. To help resolve it. I mean, the Kenyan people, the ordinary man on the street. And the African Union, of course, also, realized the role the U.S. plays in Kenya. And so when we encouraged the African Union to help mediate that crisis, we knew it was important that there be an African lead to do that. And we then worked with Kofi Annan in a supporting role. So very intensely so. I mean, with Condoleezza Rice visiting Kenya, President Bush and others involved as well. So it was sort of a natural thing for the U.S. to do that, and we do consider Kenya strategically important in the Horn of Africa. And as I say, we had that relationship which enabled us to play that role.
Now I'm going to shift gears to your time in Mali. You were also an ambassador from 1999 to 2000 in Mali. And what do you think about the chaos in Mali right now? Do you think the roots of what's going on right now go back to when you were there?
Well, they do in a way. It's tragic. What's happening there is a tragedy for the world. You consider things like Timbuktu as a World Heritage Site. It's really one of the treasures of the world. The architecture, the city itself, the ancient manuscripts that are up there. So it's appalling. It's unthinkable what is happening in the destruction of some of those things by these extremists and terrorists, really. Well, the roots go back a long way. It's a very complex thing to try to explain, but you've always had the Tuaregs who live in the north. They are a separate ethnic group. They have always wanted to have a degree of independence, or at least autonomy, not necessarily independence. There have been civil wars in Mali in the past, and what we've seen now is Al-Qaeda's ability to come in across the borders, Algeria, but ultimately from Libya and the Maghreb, to try to exploit those tensions which have always existed between North and South, and ultimately to create that alliance, really alliance of convenience, to be able to take the North in effect. It's not something, these extremists do not have popular support. I spent a lot of time in northern Mali. Those people are not extremists in any sense. I was a great friend of the imams up there and of the Tuaregs, and those people cherish their history. They cherish those ancient manuscripts. Mali has always had a religious tradition that kind of marries. It's in a way it's African traditions with Islam and in a way that's best suited for their country. And so what's been brought into northern Mali is importation from outside the country. As I say, it's a marriage of convenience, if you will, with the local people who have always wanted a degree of autonomy, and I think who now feel very uncomfortable with that kind of extremism. It'll take international action to ultimately resolve that, because I don't think the government of Mali itself is sufficiently capable to do so. So there are historic roots to what's happening, but a lot of it has been brought in from the outside.
Interesting. Well, on a lighter note, I finally, during your time in Kenya, you met your wife, who's also Kenyan, and have expressed interest in settling there permanently. I think you expressed that last year. I'm not sure if you still
Well,
want
as
that.
people said, there are all kind of rumors. I have a foot in both countries, if you will, now, and I think technically under the new Kenyan Constitution, I'm probably entitled to be a dual national. But but
what is it about Kenya and its people that you connected with?
Well,
during your time
again,
there?
the people there love Americans. They are very friendly towards Americans. They're a very smart people. Very high rate of literacy in Kenya, one of the highest in the African continent. I think that's probably reflected in the fact that social media plays such a pervasive role in Kenya. So it's a very warm place, very rich culture, of all the different ethnic groups, and a diversity in the geography and the land and all that. So there's a lot to capture the imagination in Kenya. And then, as Prime Minister Odinga put it very well, some event I was at, he said, Kenya's given, the U.S. has given us Barack Obama, now Kenya's given something back to the U.S. So there you go. So we met just by accident, actually on 9/11, of all things. Unbelievable, on 9/11. I was at an event in a little village down in Masai Mara, down in Enosen, in the Mara, and she was running a women's group called Cherish Others, and she came up to me to talk about the organization. Didn't know her from Adam or whatever. I was impressed by her courage and being willing to talk and defy the local elders, to do it. And we followed up, and things happened.
Rest is history, as they say.
That's it.
So, do you have any final note to your view of U.S.-Africa relationship in general?
Well, I'm very optimistic about Africa. I have been for a long time. A lot of people, particularly Americans, what captures the headlines of the wars, what's going on, in the Congo right now, or the Sudan Civil War, Somalia, you name it, Liberia. And there have been a history of horribly tragic things, obviously, including the Rwandan genocide. But if you look past all of those things, which continent in the world has not experienced that sort of thing? But if you look beyond that, what you've seen is a steady progression in Africa, and you've also got to put it in perspective. African countries have been independent for at most 50 years, which is a very small amount of time in the grand scheme of things. I mean, I always put it in the perspective of the United States. I mean, heck, it took us 100 years to get to the Civil War, and then it took us another 100 years, and we're still working on civil rights and equality. And as Barack Obama himself said, his election is only a step in that process. It does not mean in any way, shape, or form that that's over, as we've all seen. And so, you've got to put these things in context. And if you put it in context, I think Africa has made enormous progress since independence. It's got a long way to go. And, you can't, it's also important, if you're talking to Africans, to say you can't hide behind history either. You can't say, oh, well, it took the United States 200 years, it's going to take us 200 years, because the pace of change in the modern world has accelerated, and African society has to move in a way to catch up with that, if you will, and I think that is happening. I think there's more popular pressure on leaders to change. I think democracy is taking root in Africa, and development is moving in some surprisingly important ways. So again, I'm optimistic about the future of Africa, and I think you'll see the United States heavily engaged in Africa in the coming years.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you.